there's such a need to have that hope because, again, that hope changes the experiences for a survivor's healing, more so than we even know through research. After 25 years of doing this work and talking to thousands of survivors, I can tell you anecdotally how much that can impact survivors.
Welcome, and thank you for joining me for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast, coming to you from the Podvlog studio in St. George, Utah, and produced by Markel Consulting, LLC. I'm your host, Dave Markel. Welcome back, everyone. I'm glad you're here. This is episode 74, and my guest this week is the CEO of Callisto, Tracy DeTomasi. Callisto is a nonprofit organization designed to help victims of rape and sexual assault connect with others who may have been sexually assaulted by the same person. If you're unaware of Callisto, or you've heard of it but don't know anything about it, you're in the right place. Tracy is going to tell us everything you need to know about Callisto. Here's Tracy. Tracy DeTomasi, thank you so much for being with me today on SAS. I'm really glad you're here.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
Could you give us some background on your experience, maybe your educational background, and then your background with Callisto and how the organization got started?
Yeah, I'd love to. So I am the CEO of Callisto, and my background is really as a licensed clinical social worker. So I've been a social worker for well over 20 years now, and I've worked in the field of gender-based violence throughout my entire career. I actually started my career as a therapist for adolescent sex offenders. So started working with offenders who had also all been victims, worked with teens in group homes for a long time, and then transitioned working into a different kind of residential, which was a domestic violence shelter. And through that work, really thought about all of the amazing things that my teams were doing, helping victims, but it wasn't really stopping the problem. And so really got more focused in creating programs that address the root causes of gender-based violence, such as the culture and how we talk and the language we use and toxic masculinity and a lot of those things. And when Callisto recruited me to be the CEO, it was a no-brainer because it really did two things that I had done throughout my entire career. And that was help survivors in a different way, as well as address perpetrators, because I think that perpetrators are so often left out of the conversation. And I'm sure we'll talk about that in a little bit. But I really think that Callisto is a change that will really create an impact. And in the 20 plus years I've been doing the work in gender-based violence, the numbers haven't really changed very much. And I think Callisto has the opportunity to actually make a significant impact while helping survivors at the same time.
Yeah, I think it's an amazing program. Could you, for the sake of our audience, tell them what Callisto is and how it actually works?
Yeah, absolutely. Callisto created technology, which we call Callisto Vault, to help survivors determine if their perpetrator has harmed anybody else. So that's simply put. There's a lot of back-end technology that is at play, and we use a lot of cryptography to make it really secure and encrypted. So our whole system is very secure. Basically, the gist of it is that a survivor they go in, they look to enter into matching, and they will put in the state where the assault occurred. They put in the unique identifier of a perpetrator. So that's the perpetrator's social media handle, email address, or phone number. They put in as much of that information as they know. And then they wait. And if somebody else puts in the same unique identifier of that same perpetrator, so that perpetrator's same Instagram handle, Facebook handle, LinkedIn, phone number, whatever the case may be, there's a match. The survivors aren't immediately notified that there's a match, but we at Callisto are notified. However, it's not a database that we can search through. So the identity of the survivor and the identity of the perpetrator still remain encrypted to us. But what we can do is that we can assign that case to a legal options counselor who is somebody that we contract with. And that information is protected under attorney-client privilege. And that legal options counselor can see the entire entry, And they go and they connect with the survivors individually. And that's the first time the survivor has to explain what happened to them. They explain what happened to them to the legal option counselor, and then they get options. What is the legal definition of criminal sexual assault in their state? What does it mean to have a civil case versus a criminal case? What does Title IX mean? What are the legal ramifications if they blast their perpetrator's name on social media, whatever the case may be, or if they need mental health resources? If after that conversation, the survivors want to connect with each other and know their identity, they go through the risks of what that might involve, and then the legal option counselor works to connect the survivors. In the past, and you can see this in the height of Me Too, journalists were doing this work. Journalists were doing the work of connecting survivors, or there were these different lists that were out there or different social media platforms that were out there to connect survivors. However, typically lists on social media got shut down for defamation, and the owners of those lists got sued. And journalists can be a protected source, but not necessarily, and that's not always safe. And that only happened for survivors whose perpetrators were of influence, had power, and were worthy of a story in the media. And so a lot of people didn't get that privilege to be able to connect to see if their perpetrator harmed somebody else. And we know that it can be a game changer for survivors to know that they were not the only one, and it alleviates a lot of guilt for survivors. Right now, anybody with a .edu email address in the US and its territories has free access to this service. And that's what's really important to us, is that it doesn't cost the survivor anything. And we know that in academia in the US, 90% of sexual assault on college campuses are committed by serial perpetrators who on average offend 6 times while in college. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to connect just 2 of those survivors to then have a chance at better accountability, so that if that perpetrator is held accountable and stops perpetrating and doesn't perpetrate those other 4 people, that reduces college sexual assault by 59% while helping and validating the experience of those 2 survivors.
That's a significant amount.
It is.
So right now, the people who have access to this system are, as you mentioned, those who have a .edu email address. So those are typically students or, in some cases, alumni of certain college campuses. Is the system available to others? Does Callisto have another system for non.edu email holders?
Not yet, but we're working on it. So right now, anybody with a .edu address, so you can be a faculty member, a staff, an alumni, if you still have access to your .edu, or a student. And that student could be a graduate student, it can be a PhD student, it could be a bachelor's level undergrad student. And that's a lot of people in the US that have access. It's in the millions. And we are looking to expand beyond that. We are a nonprofit, so we rely on generous donors and foundations. And in order to make that happen, we need more bandwidth, which means we need more financial support. So we are in the process of creating a pilot program that's not quite off the ground yet. If any of your listeners are interested in learning more, or are connected to funding sources or are generous donors, I would love to speak with them, because we do know that while sexual assault is rampant within college campuses, it's rampant everywhere. And we would love to one day be able to open this up to anybody who wants to use it. But right now, we just don't have the bandwidth and the capacity for that.
Yeah, that's understandable. And the fact that you actually are US-wide on the .edu basis is fairly recent, am I right? It was only a few short months ago that
Correct.
You expanded to all campuses. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so we launched our new technology in the fall of 2021. We were supposed to launch in 2020, but of course the pandemic had different plans for us. But we launched it among a certain group of schools in 2021. And we wanted to make sure that our technology worked and that we could actually find matches, because this technology is revolutionary. Nobody else is using this technology. Nobody else has created it. And we found success. Within that pilot, about 15% of our entries found a match. And that means that 15% of people who entered a perpetrator found somebody else who put in the same perpetrator. And that's pretty significant. And so when we figured out that, yes, it does indeed work, we wanted to figure out how to give access to as many people as possible. And so in October of 2023, we expanded access to anybody with a .edu email address. And since that time, we've had cross-campus matches, which means that students don't go to the same schools. And that includes a coast-to-coast match. So one survivor is on one coast, one survivor is on the other coast, and yet the perpetrator was the same person. And we know that happens because we know that survivors leave school. And we also know that perpetrators leave school. And we also know that perpetrators aren't always connected to schools. And so the perpetrator can be anybody. The perpetrator does not have to have a .edu email address. The perpetrator can be anybody that has assaulted some other person. And one other fact that I should say is that we don't define sexual assault for the survivor, because we know that the definition of sexual assault legally varies from state to state. And we also know that survivors define it differently. So what we define it as is however you felt that you did not give consent. And that can mean anything. That can mean harassment, that can mean rape, that can mean a variety of different types of sexual assault. And we let the survivor name that. Because we're not investigating cases and because everything within Callisto is protected, either through the encryption or through confidentiality, it doesn't get shared. We are not a reporting service. We don't report to police. We don't report to Title IX. And so all of that information is safe for the survivor as well as the accused. And so there's no false accusations. There's no false reporting because we are not a reporting service. And within the Callisto system, it is the responsibility of the survivor to report if they want to. And we know that can be really difficult for survivors and often much more re-traumatizing. And so that's why we put that power back in the hands of survivors.
I'm going to guess that based on the fact that a lot of college campus or university campus law enforcement also have .edu email addresses, they might, I'm guessing, reach out to you and say, hey, can you help us with this case or that case? And not really understanding that that's not what Callisto's role is. But do you get those kinds of requests from not only law enforcement, but Title IX investigators and administrators?
We have at times more from Title IX than law enforcement or the campus security, but I think that we'll continue to get those requests in the future, and we won't share it. Right. We won't share that information unless we have consent from the survivor. If it helps the survivor and the survivor reaches out and says, hey, can you share this information about their individual case, we can share, or we can connect the survivor with that local law enforcement. So if that local law enforcement said, hey, we've got this perpetrator, we believe that there's more cases. If you have more of a case, can you let them know? Or if you know more victims who have identified this perpetrator and haven't reported, can you let them know that we're actively investigating this? And we would pass off that information and be a liaison to the survivor. But again, confidentiality, security of the survivor and protecting those survivors is of utmost concern for us. And we focus there first.
Because of the potential for lawsuit. That is, like you just said, of utmost importance in the Callisto system.
It is. And oftentimes people say, well, why aren't you trying to do more to hold the perpetrator accountable? And I think when people say that, I don't think that they fully understand what the criminal justice system is or any of the systems that survivors report to and how traumatic that can be and how that's often more traumatizing than the assault itself, because of how those systems are set up. I often say that people think of law enforcement and the criminal justice system as an episode of Law and Order SVU, and it is nothing like that. That is complete fiction. As you've been in law enforcement, you absolutely know that, and that's not how it happens. And there's been times where I've talked to survivors over the years where they've had video evidence. They have audio evidence. They have text messages that state these things that the perpetrator has done. And still law enforcement has either been unwilling or unable to hold that perpetrator accountable.
I hate to say it, but it's crazy how accurate that is. And it's sad. And it's part of why I wanted this podcast to exist, is to educate not only victims and survivors of that misnomer, sometimes this is a harsh word, but incompetence or just a basic ignorance of the dynamics of rape and sexual assault and how that impacts survivors. Oftentimes, law enforcement officials and prosecutors don't know the difficulties that rape victims, sexual assault victims are going through. That's why I think what you're doing is so important, is that it gives victims and survivors this avenue of knowing that somebody cares and somebody's keeping this log of offenders. That leads me to the legal options counselors. How do you vet them, and do they have an expertise in the dynamics of sexual assault and rape?
The legal option counselors that we use are all vetted by us through a trauma-informed lens. They have a significant amount of history and experience working with victims and survivors of sexual violence, and they know how terrible the systems can be, and they want to advocate for survivors. And so there's a lot of training that goes into that, and we want to make sure that the survivors, from the minute they are contacted, feel safe and they feel secure by that legal options counselor, because that is an important part of the process. Not all attorneys have that. Not all legal advocates have that level of being trauma informed. And that will change the direction and change the healing of a survivor if that first person that they meet is not trauma informed. As a licensed clinical social worker, that's what I'm most concerned with. If a survivor feels heard and validated, they will continue on in the process of their own healing and of trying to hold the perpetrator accountable. And if they don't, both of those things will stop until there's a time in the future where they will want to continue. And I think that that is one of the huge benefits of Callisto and Callisto Vault, is that on average, it takes college students about 11 months to report if they are going to report. That's if they report. And only 6 to 10% of survivors actually report to Title IX or to police or to authorities. If we can connect them, they're more likely to report, because maybe they thought what was a drunken night and it might have been their fault. When they heard that the perpetrator did it the exact same way to somebody else, they don't feel as blamed.
Yeah.
They realize that the perpetrator was manipulative and it wasn't their fault of drinking too much. There's so many times where survivors and victims blame themselves for being drunk, but I could be blackout drunk 100 times and never get assaulted. But maybe one out of one of those 100 times, if I was blackout drunk, I got assaulted. So drinking isn't the issue, because 99% of the time, nothing happened. It was the one time that I was in the presence of a perpetrator that I was assaulted. That's not the messaging that society gives survivors at all. You can hear through the generations of, oh, that, and I'm going to use gender language where the male is the perpetrator, because most of the time the male is the perpetrator, but that he took advantage of her. Took advantage is a really mild way of saying he manipulated her to sexually assault her. Yeah. But we've minimized that. Perpetrators are using that, so they're not being held accountable, and victims are using that to blame themselves, which is part of the system that we need to interrupt.
I love that you brought all that language up and those concepts, because that is the focus of where this whole process of education should be focused. And that is the victimology of rape and sexual assault, what I call rape culture, where our society has done so much to normalize the language that you just used, the take advantage of, and how victims internalize that to say, well, maybe if I hadn't gotten so drunk, maybe if I hadn't been so flirtatious, maybe I don't even remember, like you said, that blackout intoxication. I guess that's why I'm so impressed with the whole Callisto model and what you're trying to do. Can I ask what the feedback is? Do victims and survivors themselves contact you, communicate to you the impact that Callisto has had in their lives?
Absolutely. Through our Instagram, mostly, we get DMs all the time of thank you for existing. Thank you for giving me hope. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to realize that this might not have been my fault. We have Callisto ambassadors, which are volunteer students who spread the word on their campuses. And you can look on our Instagram feed to see how some of them have posted videos about their experiencing of knowing that Callisto existed and how they cried. And how just knowing that we existed without even potentially experiencing a match was so powerful, because it shows that there is somebody building technology and spending money and investing in this because it's bad enough. because enough perpetrators are serial perpetrators that there is a nonprofit dedicated just to that. And that in and of itself is validating. And I cannot tell you how many people I meet and they ask, what do you do? And I explain to them what I do. And I explain to them Callisto. And then there's a pause. And I know every time what's going to come after that pause. And every time they say, I wish that this existed when I was in college. And that is from women. That is from men. That is from trans and non-binary individuals, because sexual assault is so pervasive and there hasn't been a way to report it well in the past. You can look at cases like Larry Nassar, the doctor from Michigan State University and USA Gymnastics. He was reported to Title IX numerous times. He was reported to police numerous times throughout decades, but those survivors were not able to connect because he was never found guilty. And so those cases went away and a fresh person would start, and those weren't being tracked until a journalist in Indianapolis wrote a story about it, and Rachel Denhollander decided to put her name public. And when she did, other survivors were like, is that what he did to me? Is that assault? Because they didn't know. And it sounds strange to think, how does somebody know that they weren't assaulted?
Yeah.
And it goes back to what you said about rape culture. It's what we define as rape. People think that rape is the scary thing of a man coming out behind a bush and violently attacking you, and that you would automatically fight back, because that's what we see in movies and that's what we see in TV shows and in culture. But that is not the vision of most people who've experienced sexual assault. It's by somebody you know. It's coercion. You might have consented to making out, but you didn't consent to sex. There's a lot more of quote unquote gray areas than you would imagine. And until fairly recent history, and I'm not sure the exact year, rape laws used to say that you had to fight back in order for it to be deemed rape. When we know that most people, when there's a fight, flight, freeze, or a fawn response, trauma response, most people freeze.
That's right.
And that is an automatic biological response that your body does.
Yes.
And so you can think, I would fight. But you don't have control over that necessarily.
Until it happens.
So you freeze.
Yeah, you don't
until
know.
It happens.
And that freeze response is the first response biologically that our bodies are programmed to do. And it's built into our brains. And you're right, we have absolutely no control over that. So no matter how much you forecast in the future, if I'm ever attacked, if I'm ever touched in a certain way, I will do this. No, you do not know until that actually happens how your brain will react.
I'm not sure if you know when that law changed, but it was in the 80s or 90s that law started to change. So you still have a lot of law enforcement and a lot of people in the legal system that are still operating under that definition. Right. Whether that definition has changed or not, they haven't progressed their understanding of it enough because they haven't been intentional enough. So they still think, well, you didn't scream, so how bad must it have been?
Right.
And there's things where offenders look at what's called DARVO, deny, attack, reverse victim and offender. And that's what they've used to get away with their crimes. And having worked with offenders, I know how they do it and how well they do it and how the society allows them to do it. And so that is why victims often feel responsible for their own victimization, because the perpetrator, with society as a whole, has conditioned them to reverse victim and offender. So the offender now becomes the one that's been falsely accused. The offender becomes the one of, don't ruin my career. You know, you look at the case of Brock Turner. His dad said, something about his 20 minutes of action, and that he shouldn't have gotten his life ruined for 20 minutes of action. But what about Chanel Miller's life?
Exactly.
And the impact that it has on her.
That is such a sad example, you know, and the fact that prosecution was asking, if I remember correctly, for 14 plus years of incarceration, and he got 3 months.
Yeah, I think he got 6 months and served 3.
Is that
if I remember right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
But yeah, the statistics on incarceration for sexual perpetrators is abysmal.
It really is.
Abysmal. And there are also studies of college-age men of, if they knew they would not be held accountable, would they force somebody into having sex? And a majority of them say yes.
Mm-hmm. And you've probably seen Dr. David Lisak's research on some of the same information about serial offenders and how common it really is and how pervasive it is across mostly college campuses. You talk about sex offenders offending probably 6 times during their college years. I think it's probably much higher. I think that's a low.
I think it's higher.
Yeah, based on LISAC's research and other research that's been done.
Anecdotally, when I was a therapist for adolescent sex offenders in the early 2000s, and out of all the clients I had, every one of them had at least 5 to 10 victims. Most of them were ages 12 to 17. Mm-hmm. So they had already had that many victims. And a lot of it is they were taught what to do because they were victims. Treatment for offenders is effective. It's very effective. And so there are other routes of accountability beyond the criminal justice system that a lot of times survivors want to happen because they know the person. They don't want the person to be locked up, because we think of offenders being these terrible, awful human beings that are evil, but they're not. Bill Cosby got away with everything that he got away with because he did a lot of good in this world, and he was really charismatic, and people loved him. And the same with Larry Nassar, and the same with Harvey Weinstein. We can vilify them now because we see the collective pattern of what they did. But when you're looking at individuals, it was much harder to see that collective pattern. And that's what we're doing at Callisto, is identifying that collective pattern.
Right. Which is why I think Callisto is so important. As you mentioned, there's no other technology out there being applied like this. I know there are other organizations that are starting to enact and implement this type of technology and a database system for repeat offenders. The military, for instance, is working on something very similar.
From what I've been told, they base their system off of Callisto.
Which makes sense.
But it's still a reporting tool. And I don't know the ins and outs of the catch program in the military. But one of the things that is unique about Callisto is that we are a neutral third-party nonprofit. We are not within those systems. And so if you look at Jennifer Freed's research on institutional betrayal, you can create a matching system within the already existing reporting systems. But if people still don't trust the institution, they're still not going to use that reporting tool. Yeah. And that's the issue, is that those reporting tools are not trusted because of institutional betrayal. We are outside of those systems.
Yeah. And I see on Instagram, for instance, a lot of educational type posts that Callisto puts out. Do you have an educational arm in the organization itself to help society learn these statistics and these issues and these dynamics around rape and sexual assault and offender mentality versus victimology and survivorship?
We do and we don't. So our focus really is the technology, but we have to educate people why the technology exists, because there's so many people that don't understand. And so within educating people about why the technology exists, yes. So we do presentations, we do trainings on all of that, but we also partner with other organizations that are doing that education at a different level, because we want to use our resources and we want to stay in our lane with the technology, because there's so many people that are doing that education really, really well. And we want to support their work, and we want them to include our resources within their work. And so we don't have to continue to waste resources doing the same thing that so many others are doing so well.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, so we work with organizations like End Rape on Campus. We work with organizations like It's On Us that are already doing that in the college space, so they can do the education and use us as another resource, just like you would the sexual assault hotline. When you put the sexual assault hotline as a resource when you're talking with college students, put Callisto as a resource when you're talking to college students, because that's really what we are.
Is there any official collaboration going on with other nonprofits? I know you mentioned that you utilize and direct people to those organizations, but are there official memorandums of understanding or some sort of collaboration going on between Callisto and other organizations?
A lot of times we don't need to be formalized because, we've got a toolkit online that you can download that anybody can use.
Yeah, good. It seems like I could talk to you all day long about the dynamics that we've touched on with regard to the healing process. I don't know how to address that in terms of the impact that you feel Callisto is having on that aspect. You touched on it a while ago about the fact that telling victims that you believe them, you validate their story in that belief system, and you don't blame them. Where does that go with Callisto?
I think that Callisto takes on the stance of we start by believing survivors because so many of them are not believed because so many people have a hard time changing their belief about the perpetrator that they know. This is a good person. How could this good person do something so heinous? So the natural logical step that you jump to in your brain is the survivor must be lying. But if you start with the survivor must be telling the truth, and it gets to the point where the survivor's not telling the truth, you'll know. But if you start by that, that has a bigger impact on the survivor and their healing of not being believed. Because as soon as they're not being believed, they internalize that message, they stop talking, the impacts are significant for years and years and years. And just knowing that the perpetrator did it to somebody else can change that experience. I can tell you a story about Jess Michaels, and she has given me permission to share this. Otherwise, I would not share a survivor story. And she has talked about this on our Instagram feed as well as her TEDx talk. She's a 1991 survivor of Jeffrey Epstein, and she was raped by him, and then she went into deep despair and had significant trauma impacts for 30 years. And until 2018, I think it was, she was scrolling and she saw his face and she didn't know his name. And she said, that was the person that assaulted me. Had no idea who it was. Went back in all of her journals and realized that, yes, that was Jeffrey Epstein and that who assaulted her back in the 90s. And that moment changed her healing because she was finally validated after 30 years. And now she's creating this amazing work to help allies know how to respond in sexual assault first aid. She trains people on sexual assault first aid so you know how to treat sexual assault like an injury. Because if you're triaging a situation and somebody's got a broken leg, you're not trying to figure out the crime. You're trying to figure out how to make sure that that injury is dealt with first. And we don't do that with sexual assault. We do so many more things that make that injury worse. But just knowing that she was not the only one completely changed her healing after 30 years of holding it all in. That's the impact that Callisto can have. I've gotten survivors that say, I put my perpetrator's information in because I know that there's still a professor at the school and they assaulted me 15 years ago when I was a graduate student and there's still a professor. And so I have to imagine that they're still assaulting somebody else.
Yeah.
There is such a need to have that hope because, again, that hope changes the experiences for a survivor's healing, more so than we even know through research. After 25 years of doing this work and talking to thousands of survivors, I can tell you anecdotally how much that can impact survivors.
I totally agree. And I've got tons of anecdotal evidence of that myself. It's amazing the impact that being validated can actually have on people's lives. I'm so glad Callisto exists for those very reasons. Tracy, do you want to talk a little bit about your experience with offenders and the offender mentality that you're familiar with? You're right. So many of these people are good people on the surface. Their hidden persona that does offend is not the majority part of their personality that people see. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's been decades since I've done the work with offenders, but having been in this space for long enough, I still know that there are just so many different types of offenders. And I think that we try to, as a society, to collectively put offenders into one box, and that is these evil predators. And not all perpetrators are these evil predators. I think that there's a lot of perpetrators who don't understand what consent is. And if they understood what consent was, and they understand how they were violating consent, they would stop immediately. I think that there's others that are really manipulative and very calculated, and there's a spectrum. There's just a spectrum of offenders. The impact to victims and the impact to survivors can be the same regardless of the spectrum of offending. And so I think that that's really important to point out. But I think when the justice system is responding to offenders, most of the time they treat most offenders like they're these really innocent people that just didn't know any better. And while I do believe that is the case for so many, We need to start changing that conversation about perpetrators to make sure that we fully understand that, because until we really start talking about perpetrators, we're not really going to understand how to prevent sexual assault, and we're not going to understand how to respond and hold perpetrators accountably in the most effective ways.
And I think it's interesting that you brought up before, and you're alluding to now, the whole concept that jail, incarceration, may not be the best treatment for offenders.
It might not be. And I think accountability, for what survivors want as accountability, looks different for every survivor. And if you want them to go to jail and they violated you, they should do time in jail. Absolutely. I'm an advocate for that. And I think that accountability is necessary for any type of rehabilitation for offenders. If there's no accountability, there's no rehabilitation, period. There has to be accountability first, and it's usually external, and it's usually in the form of a punishment. Yeah. And so, but it doesn't necessarily mean being locked up in jail or prison, but it can be. But I think holding perpetrators accountable is the necessary first step that as a collective society we are not doing.
I totally agree with that. Tracy, is there an area or question that you kind of anticipated talking about that I haven't gotten to?
Yeah, the one thing I would love to talk about is the fact that our technology works. It is powerful, it works, but it's only as good as the amount of people that know about it. Right now, we are relying on people to spread the word for us, who believe in us, who have that trust, who understand it, to be those early adopters. So if your audience has a .edu and has been assaulted, please use our system. If you are connected to an academic institution, please let as many people at that institution know that they have access. We have a free toolkit that people can download on our website, which is projectcallisto.org. And they can download the toolkit that has business cards and posters and different sizes of collateral that they can print for free and put up in the areas that they work in. So if they're SANE nurses, if they're law enforcement, if they're lawyers doing this work, if they're rape crisis centers, they can put these resources up and spread the word about this, because the more people that know, the more chances of matches that are going to happen. If you can follow a sexual assault organization on social media, please follow us at Callisto on Instagram. We're on LinkedIn. We're on Facebook at Callisto.org, we're on Twitter, X. And just liking and engaging our content and sharing our content is really helpful, because you don't know who is a survivor in your life that may not have told you that is looking for that information. I can't tell you the amount of times that I have had over the years where I share content and somebody from my past has reached out to me who I haven't talked to in decades and says, "Hey, I keep seeing your posts. Can we talk? Can you be a resource for my friends? What do I do with this situation that I just found out about?" Or I thought of you, and they share things because they thought about me and the work that I do. And so you don't know. Share as much as you can and engage with our content and tell people about us. I would love to be on more podcasts. I would love to be in more articles talking about this, because more and more people need to know. And it's hard to get the word out for a tool that nobody ever wants to have to use.
I'm honored to be a part of getting the word out. I'm very thankful that you've joined me in this episode so that I can make sure my listeners are aware of Callisto and you and all that you and your organization are doing. I appreciate you so much.
I appreciate you spreading the word. It's really important to us.
Thank you again, Tracy. This has been amazing. I love the information that you are willing to share, and hope that this does have an impact on my audience, and that you see an impact in the response. Not only an increase in people who are participating in Callisto by joining that database, but also in donations. I want to get that word out too, that Callisto could use donations of any amount.
Yep, we appreciate donors that donate $5 or $5,000 or $50,000. Whatever you're capable of giving. You can also go to our website, again, projectcallisto.org, and start your own campaign. You click the donate button on the top right-hand corner of our website. It will take you to a page where if you can't afford to donate $5,000, but you think that you can crowdsource that to get people to donate, you can start your own campaign. And all of that really helps spread the word about Callisto and helps us keep it free for survivors out there.
That's fantastic. Thank you again, Tracy. look forward to talking to you again in the future, and let's stay in touch.
Yes, definitely. Thank you. If you need anything else, let me know.
I will. I appreciate your time.
Yep. Bye.
That does it for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. I want to extend my deep and sincere appreciation to Tracy DeTomasi for taking the time out of her busy schedule to be with me on the show. Thank you, Tracy, for explaining and sharing what Callisto is all about. And I also want to thank the entire staff and board at Callisto for all you're doing to help bring justice to victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault. We all appreciate the work that you're doing. Hey listeners, do you want to be a part of what Callisto is doing? Go to their website and download their toolkit, become an ambassador, or start your own fundraising project. It's easy to do all three because all the information you need is right there on their website. And don't forget that another way to help bring justice to victims and survivors of rape or sexual assault is to start by believing. Because we all know someone whose life has been impacted by rape or sexual assault. Thanks again for listening. If you haven't already, please subscribe to this podcast, leave a rating, and tell others that we're here. It all helps this podcast grow. Thanks again. We'll see you next week.